Good afternoon, Jonathan.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for being here straight off the plane from KL. And yeah, welcome to Hong Kong.
It's my first time here, so I'm very excited to see the place and also to have this conversation.
The podcast is Destination Education, and we focus a lot on UK independent education. So this is our first time to broaden the topic a little bit to UK education that's not exactly in the UK, which we'll get on to.
Yeah.
But I'd like to start by asking you, as I do all of our guests, you're from the UK and educated in the UK. Could you tell us about your own education?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for me, the big thing is the power of education that I saw when I was in it, but also kind of advising students. My background was a very typical one, actually. I went to my local kind of comprehensive school, and through that, I kind of saw, I think, like genuinely the sort of power of education for social mobility, I think. And, I was the first person in my family to go to university. So, and, I had some guidance at university when I was at school, but I didn't necessarily think the best quality guidance that you can get.
I was going to ask you, because in my day, when the area where I grew up, comprehensives were to be avoided, shall I say?
And as comprehensive go, I think it was a pretty good one. And I had some very good teachers. They're very inspiring teachers. But, there wasn't necessarily the time, resources to guide students in the way that I've been doing for the last sort of 20 years or so. So it's one of those things, you look at the things that were powerful there in terms of social mobility, but you also look at the things that could have been improved. It's stuck with me definitely that I think it's so important that you're giving bespoke advice and guidance to every individual. I probably feel so strongly about that because of my own experiences.
So what sort of size of the class were we talking about?
Yeah, I mean, interesting. That was probably when I was doing A-levels between sort of 15 and 20. So it's pretty large. And some of the classes that I taught when I was, teaching in the state sector would have been 20, 25, which is quite...
Not so large.
Yeah, but still sort of when you're kind of doing A-levels, and, the students kind of need a bit more one-to-one, and particularly writing long essays, things like that. It can be quite tricky to do that in a larger class.
So wait, we've skipped a few steps.
Yes, we have.
You being at school, and then you went to uni, and then how did you get into teaching? Yeah,
so that's really interesting. And actually, my first experience of, it's kind of come full circle, my first experience of teaching was actually in Asia. So, and I have to put this down to my wife. She, is quite bold and said, look, we should go out and teach in Japan. So we went out 2004 after we'd done master's degrees and went to Japan and were teaching there from 2004 to 2005. So a good 20 years ago, but that was my first experience of kind of over the table sort of teaching. It was obviously teaching English. Yeah. But even then, quite enjoyed, there was a room called the voice room where you could just go in and you just responded to the people who were in there, and you could kind of take it anywhere. And I really quite liked that.
This.
Indeed, yeah. And that was so really good experience, and loved Asia. We both fell in love a little bit with Asia there, I think, in terms of how friendly, how safe, and just how culturally interesting it is.
Well, I've been here for 31 years.
So
in a week or so.
Concur.
I will.
Oh, wow.
That's amazing. Came for 12 months in 95. So, welcome back.
Thank you.
So how did you do a master's in education?
That's interesting. I did a BA in history and then got some funding to do a master's degree. So did that in history as well. Did sort of think about maybe staying in higher education. But my experience in Japan made me realize I wanted to teach. So went back to Bath University then to do my PGCE. And, you never know how it's going to go. But look, I loved being in the classroom, still do, I still teach. And I love my subject, but the chemistry of kind of delivering content with students who really want to learn and I want to also not just learn the content, but how to use it, how to kind of, put information and evidence together to put together compelling arguments, that sort of in a kind of written sense. And it was really, really struck me, and I really enjoyed it. But also, as I've gone into independent education as well, through debating as well, there's definitely, a parent asked me the other day, history, it sounds a bit like debating. And I said, It kind of is, history is kind of, debating in written form. And then when you kind of go on the stage, that's where you're kind of using the same argument, same style, but in a kind of more oral way.
Interesting, because I'm thinking about history as being more knowledge, like,
Yeah.
rooted. It's stuff that happened in the past. And yet so much of the conversations that we're having these days are about skills.
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. So, for me, I would say, and I think I'd still stick to this, that, the best education you can get uh, uh, if you want to be a lawyer is to do history. Because not only are you putting together a really compelling argument, you're looking at the other side and seeing how to deconstruct it and undermine it. And that's what you're kind of doing in the courtroom, or in the sort of the papers and the kind of dialogue that's going back and forth.
So maybe by the time you get to A-level history, which I didn't get that far. Interesting. So I want to talk, knowledge, skills, that's the key theme that we're hearing these days. But because of your background, I just want to touch on some of these things. I've asked lots of our guests that have similar sort of experiences. You've worked in boys' schools, you've worked in girls' schools, and you're now working in a co-ed school. Obviously, what we're seeing in the UK is the demise of single-sex schools, very much so with boys. I think there's like 3 or 4 full board. I'm talking about boarding schools that are left. What's your take on this?
It's interesting. I think, because the market is under pressure, there has been a lot of demand on or opportunity for those schools to go co-ed, and you can kind of see the commercial drive for that. But I'd probably say more so. Like, I worked in a boys' grammar, and it was interesting. I felt like I could, sort of help to shape the boys there and make sure that they were kind of approaching the world in a kind of tolerant way, and in a way that was going to be inclusive of everyone. In that context, actually, there was a girls' grammar school next door. And they were separated. It's that model where, you're separated, then you come back, the kind of pyramid. And so we had boys and girls in the sixth form. It was very interesting. So initially they would, kind of gravitate to opposite sides of the school, of the classroom. And then as they got to know each other, they'd come together. But in terms of my take on it, I think, and look, I was 7 years at CLC. So the power of kind of girls' education, I think, is really, really important. If you're going to kind of encourage those girls to be confident, to kind of see that there's no glass ceiling, it's important that they get that education, and they're not, having the space dominated by boys, as can often be the case, particularly in those middle years, and that their voice is heard, and that they see that the sky is the limit. And I think, maybe girls are maybe in a co-ed setting are more confident to do that once they're in the sixth form. But if you're not seeing that modeled in those earlier years, I think you can perhaps wrongly think that, I shouldn't be kind of driving the conversation.
Why wouldn't you be seeing that modelled in earlier years in a co-ed setting? You should, right? You
should. It's an excellent question. You should. But that comes down to the teacher to ensure that everybody's voice is heard. And we do that through cold calling, for example. Not going to ask you to put your hands up. I'm going to decide who speaks so that I can really, get some equality in the range of contributions that are coming through. But, not every teacher is necessarily going to do that. We want to see that at Epsom, but if you're not controlling that, there is a tendency or a danger that some groups can dominate.
Of course, but so much of what happens in the classroom is dependent on the teacher.
100%.
So as an excellent teacher yourself, given the choice, would you rather teach history to a class full of boys or girls or mixed?
I think I would say co-ed, because,
of course you would.
But I think you have the opportunity there to kind of, again, model something which reflects society more broadly, and to make sure that you are being inclusive. And that, again, you're hearing, particularly in our context, it's a very rich environment in which to teach anything, because you have interpretations from 40 countries across the world, boys and girls. Well, that's only going to enrich the quality of the discussion that you're having. So I would say, though, it means that you have to be a bit more skilled in making sure that you are, one, cognizant of the different cohorts you've got in any given classroom, and that you're making sure that you give equal sort of forum to each of those groups.
Let's take a quick break to talk about something that can make all the difference for your child's educational journey. I'm thrilled to share that this episode is sponsored by Top Schools, your trusted partner in navigating the complex world of school applications. If you're aiming for a top independent school in the UK, Top Schools offers personalised consulting to ensure your child finds the very best fit with a guaranteed outcome. From identifying those best fit schools to crafting standout applications to invigilating the entrance exams, the expert team is with you every step of the way. Ready to take control of your child's future? Visit topschoolsadmissions.com or click the link in the show notes to learn more and book a consultation today. Use the code DESTINATION for 20% off. That code is DESTINATION for 20% off personalised support for entry into a top independent boarding school in the UK. Now, back to our conversation. And so we're touching on, obviously, the benefits of an independent school. We'll get onto boarding as well a bit later. That's taking it another step further. But some of the benefits are that presumably the teachers are excellent without fail, without the exception. Smaller classes and highly engaged students and parents.
Yes.
What are the other benefits
of boarding? Or just
okay, let's go to boarding.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, this is a really significant question, I think. If you're in a day school, you don't see the students in their full dimension.
Yeah.
You're just seeing,
as a teacher,
as a teacher. And, the teaching experience might be, I'm there from 8, I'm out of the door at 3:30. You're not seeing them sort of, in-house. You're not seeing them socialize because students are still working stuff out. How they are when they are socializing in a boarding house, that gives you another kind of dimension into who they really are and what they're maybe coping with, what they're trying to deal with, how they're trying to present themselves. And then you're seeing them in the classroom and they might be a completely different person. So, our teachers who might well be a referee for when they're applying to university, they've not only maybe seen them in the boarding house and how they are, seen them in the classroom and seen those kind of different layers that there are to their personality. They're then, and we would expect those staff, and I've just seen it this week, we've done Mamma Mia at our school as the production, and the staff are there and they're seeing them on the stage.
Yeah.
And so they are genuinely getting a 360 kind of sense of who that student is. And that is only going to enrich the quality of guidance that you give that student because you're not basing it on, 25% of who they are as a person. You've got a real kind of sense of who they are and where they'll thrive. And boarding does give you that insight in a way that the day system doesn't.
That's a really interesting perspective because I look at boarding from the point of view of the parent and as an ex-parent myself. But your perspective as a teacher, that's really interesting.
I think also as well, we would encourage because we know the students so well, that dialogue, correspondence between teacher and parent in that environment also becomes another part of ensuring that you have, a kind of 360 kind of support for that student, because we would expect in that environment that the communication between the teacher and the parent is stronger than it would be, for example, in a day context. And, we've seen that this week when we've had parent-teacher conferences. But also you might just drop a line and say, do you know what? They were great today in the rehearsal that I just saw them in, and just to let them know that, which I think goes down really well, particularly when they're not picking up at the school gate, something like that. You might know this as a parent yourself. You just, having a day, you're not sure what's going on, it's a bit busy, have a message that just says they were just stellar in the classroom. That kind of can pick you up.
I would love to have had more messages like that. I heard pretty much nothing.
And I think that can be a model where it's a kind of...
Because they say to us, look, if you don't hear anything, no news is good news. Yeah.
Look, I think there's, I'm not saying there's anything bad in that, but I think the modern world is kind of changing a little bit. I mean, I don't think we do want to kind of completely sort of farm out the education of our children just to a school. Parents want to have more of a say, I'd say, in that now. And any kind of kind of communication that you can get about how they're doing, even if it's a small thing like that.
That's in the Asian context a bit more. Do you think that that's...
Potentially. Although, I mean, if I think about the boarding schools that I've worked at, certainly the co-ed boarding school I worked at, I think there was more of a sense of okay, this is for the school to deal with. When I was working in Cheltenham, as head of sixth form, I'd have a lot of communication with parents.
But a lot of Asian parents.
Yeah, and it was a lot of Asian parents, but
so
high expectation, potentially, but also just a sense of, I probably feel that I haven't had a conversation with you, I don't get your insight into how they're doing. Brilliant, makes complete sense, and I can perhaps give you a perspective that perhaps the tutor can't, or their house parent can't, because I'm looking at it in a slightly different way.
Yes, I know you've had a lot of experience with
Mm.
university guidance counselling,
Yes.
which we'll talk about. And you raise an interesting point that I've not thought about before, that the school writes a reference. And I think we're
Yes.
in the UK context, we're talking about UCAS, which is a
Yes.
centralised application for 5 universities. And that you're right, that reference can be super important, and
Absolutely.
that reference can be so much more rich, and because they know the student so much better. I hadn't thought of that before.
So that's important. So I used to read every reference for 160 girls in the year group when I was at CLC. And, I'd adjust things, amend things if I thought it didn't fully reflect who they were. But, and as you say, that's going to 5 universities. It gets more important when you're thinking about America.
Yeah.
Because the application to an American university is about a narrative. It's about how the academics, how the person, how their leadership qualities come together. And you're absolutely right. I always felt privileged if a student would come and see me and say, as my history teacher, can you write me a reference to apply to university? And I'd be like, absolutely, because they're kind of banking on you to kind of really show them in the best light. So there's a real opportunity there to kind of communicate the very best version of them. And you don't get that many hits.
How do you look at 160 references and make sure that each one is, in some way stands out?
I think you've hit the nub of the issue here is you need to know your students. And if students feel confident if they feel known and they feel seen. And, bluntly, it takes a lot of time to kind of get to know those students. But I would see them going around, the halls of CLC, and I'd be like, right, that guy is, that student there is doing these 3 A levels, are applying to these universities, because it was locked into my head. And I've like, they're debating over here. I know on Saturday they've got lacrosse, and you just had a sense of who they were. And I was getting good information from my tutors, from the house parents as well. But it's that kind of level of understanding which really allows you to know who they are. And, I think what we always used to do, and I've done this wherever I've been, every conversation has to be case by case. You can't just be imposing a model, which is this is how you get into X university. So, well, no, who are you? What do you want? Let's kind of really bespoke the guidance that we give to you.
There is no formula.
100%. Yeah.
But what do you think, again, culturally, you're in Asia now and you're working in Malaysia. I mean, we know that parents are very, very ambitious. I think I'm my Gen X. Yes. And mostly our parents are now millennials.
Yes.
They're still looking at the destination, whereas the students themselves are much more interested in the whole experience and the journey. And so how do you talk to parents that, well, I feel that it is much more about the journey and the destination and the whole experience for that individual student?
I think the journey is important. The destination is important. And what we're doing there, and every school will do this, is to show the very best case that could happen, the very best end result. And absolutely want to have that. But I really do think it's important to be transparent with how students are doing all the way through. When I was deputy head academic Fettes, my kind of mantra was no surprises. Sure that there are bumps in the road when you're going through an academic journey of 5 or 7 years. And there will be times when things aren't going particularly well for a student. That's life. But what you've got to do is have good communication around that. You have managed that situation as best you can. And you've got to have confidence that the school is going to manage that situation as well as they can, and be transparent with how things are going to the parent. The very worst scenario is to only find something out at the very last minute when you can't read anything about it as a parent and you feel so powerless. So what we have to do is to communicate good data, and that can be quantitative and qualitative, to the parents so that they have, we can guide, but also they have that good information so that they can inform and help their children. What they want to do on results days or when they're waiting on universities is to be able to help the child. And so often parents feel that they can't do anything because they don't understand the process fully, and they don't feel that they can guide. And that sense of not being able to help your child in a real key moment for them can be quite disconcerting.
Help them in what sense? You mean if they get a disappointment?
Disappointment, or just even, let's just take A-level results day, for example. I've been told by a university that my top university that I'm not in, my insurance is there, but what should I do here? And often you might be going for a remark, and if that remark comes back positive, you might well get into that university. my job is to kind of explain that.
Mm.
But if I can get the parents in, 2 or 3 months before that and say, this is scenario 1, this is how it could be, this is scenario 2. Yeah, they can check with me on results day, but they can calm down the child and say, look, don't worry, we've spoken, and this is scenario 1, this is scenario 2, this is what we're going to do. And that just takes away the stress and the anxiety. And again, it comes down to good communication.
Interesting. I'm wondering, I must be a very hands-off parent, but the school advised us, my 2 children went to university last year and the year before, and I pretty much didn't have anything to do with any of it.
It's interesting.
But the school actually advised us that if the children, their children, they're moving into becoming young adults, and then they need to take ownership of their own decisions. It sounds like you're more in the camp of really involving the parents.
I think really involving the parents, definitely. But I also think that you want to make sure that, as a parent myself, I would want to make sure I understood the process as well. Yeah, there's confidence in the school. That's important. But, I used to send a sort of video message saying this is what you can do on the day because it's complicated. And these are the documents, So I'm going to just bring out the headlines. If this happens, get in touch with us, of course. But if you want to know what to do, how to kind of, help your child on the day, these are some things that could be helpful. And these documents will just get into a bit more detail. So that's not to say that we were not advising the child and helping the child in the moment. But, quite often the parents that I'm dealing with, they are professionals themselves, they own businesses. They want to have the contingency plan. And if we're not doing that, what are we doing?
Yeah.
We should have a contingency plan, and we should be confident enough to communicate.
But as a parent, I would still like to be able to trust that the school have got this, because they're the experts. They've done this a million times. I saw issues with parents that were appealing for mocks to be reported as higher than they actually were, and and that happens, right?
It does. Look, integrity is number one, and you have to have a system. Sometimes when I was deputy head academic and head of sixth form, some of the only conversations I'd have with a parent in the whole 7 years that they were at the school was around predicted grades, and you have to have a robust system there, and it has to be evidence-based. And you have to explain that. So that's another level of explanation that we would give to make sure that they understood how we'd arrived at that number or letter.
I imagine that the most challenging thing of all the guests I've spoken to, the most challenging thing about your role is dealing with the parents. The children are a breeze.
Parents, parents' evenings, having parents in. I actually do, and this isn't just like a kind of a sensible political answer, but actually when you have parents in front of you, there is a real opportunity to reassure. And if you have robust processes, you're happy to share them, there's an opportunity there to say, this is what we do. And if a parent says, that's not the question I want to ask, I want answered, it's this, brilliant. There's an opportunity for me to answer that directly to you, because I think we're confident enough, certainly at Epsom and the other schools that I've worked at, to explain what our systems are. And I think sometimes, everyone's busy. They've got maybe their own, multiple mailboxes that they're dealing with for the different roles that they've got. And then, the information that comes into the parent one. And you miss things, or you maybe have, this is your window to ask a particular question that you want answered. We invite parents in so that we can reassure them that we have them and we have their children's back as well. And sometimes it's the opportunity just to communicate that, which is needed.
So I've shared a little bit as an advisor, as a parent, and you shared as a teacher, but you're also a parent.
I am also a parent. So I have 2 girls, and they are 10 and 12. So prep school and senior school. They've been with me and my wife at the various schools that we've been at. So, look, that's a real privilege. You have the opportunity there to kind of see them performing in a play or, a music recital.
Do they consider it to be a privilege?
I hope so. Whether that will change as they get into the world of teenager, it might change a little bit.
So they're with you at Epsom?
Yeah. So absolutely. It's a real... it's a really special moment when you can see your own children in the context that you work in, and when you have those opportunities to kind of see them perform is lovely.
So I want to understand a little bit more about the culture. I was talking to a parent this morning. Actually, she's a teacher, And we talk about curriculum, we talk about grades quite a lot. But I think
Yes.
the more important piece is the culture and the community,
Yes.
if you would agree. And
Yes,
so I
indeed.
imagine at Epsom Malaysia, it's a bit different to the other schools that you've worked at in the UK, but I imagine lots of similarities too.
It's really interesting. So I think you could, if we think about the things that make it different, you know, you're in Malaysia, it's international, but I would focus on the things that actually bind those experiences that I've had, and where they've been good experiences. They have been boarding schools. So a big, you know, what you want to create as a school leader is a esprit de corps. You want people to want to be in as part of that common room. And that happens when staff feel that they're being well led, that they feel listened to. And look, you might not always kind of, you know, go with whatever your staff want, but that you are prepared to consult and to kind of listen to their viewpoints. So what I would say is that, you know, the thing that binds, I would say, Fettes, CLC, and Epsom College Malaysia is that they're all boarding schools. You've got people there who have chosen to work in boarding schools, which means, you know, in some cases, working in a boarding house until, you know, 9, 10 at night, and making sure that you know, the children are put to bed safely, and investment in those children does mean that, you know, when the staff come together, there is a real warmth, because you're all there for the same purpose. You're not there just to mark the books and say goodnight or whatever. You're there to kind of to get to know those students. And because you have that, you know, united purpose, I do think that actually the warmth that I see Epsom College Malaysia staff room, very similar to CLC and Fettes. And I think it's because of the types of people. I think it is a fact that people who are working in boarding, in my experience, are more invested in students. And they really care, not just about what's going to happen in the maths class that they're teaching, but where that child is going, how that child is feeling about life in general, about their friendships, and you know, about what they might do once they leave the school.
But that comes what we were talking about earlier comes back to smaller classes.
Yes.
You're with the children more, so you get to know them and their parents so
absolutely.
much more. So you naturally would become more invested.
It's a community, and I'd say the parents are part of that community. So, you know, when all schools were dealing with COVID, it was very difficult actually to get that genuine connection with parents. So now that we have the opportunity, we do, for example, parent forums, beginnings of terms, and we say, look, come in, different headings. This will be about pathways. This will be about boarding. Come in, see us. And again, you know, put your children off and hear from us. And it's the opportunity for you to ask any questions that you've got. And so it is the kind of the school community, but I think the parents are an important part of that. And we want to make sure that our communication with them is as good as it can be and as frequent as it can be.
The boarders, their parents, are they relatively local, like not too far away?
Well, no, not in every case. I mean, it depends. So, for example, we have weekly boarders, right? So those boarders, we might have someone in Malacca, so that's an hour away, but that child is going to go back for the weekends, and so that those parents, they can come in quite easily. If they're coming to pick up, they might, you know, drop in on the house parent and say, could we just have a chat about X, Y, and Z? But actually, a lot of our parents are, you know, based in China, Japan, Korea, and other parts of the world. And obviously in those cases, you know, it isn't always possible to have the kind of face-to-face, but, you know, I had a parent, I'm still in the classroom now. I had a parent-teacher meeting last night, and, you know, some of the meetings I was having were with people who were 2 hours away, others, you know, in Japan. So it is quite varied. But I think the communication is still the important bit.
Yeah. I just want to go back to this idea of Epsom Malaysia is a UK independent school in Epsom, in Surrey, yet you're in Malaysia.
Yes.
There must be differences or challenges in that. And most of your experience has been in the UK, and we include Scotland in that. I'm from a Scottish family.
Well, the weather's kinder. So there's
in
certainly
Malaysia.
That. In Malaysia, it's a warm environment, but also a warmer place. Right. No, what I would say there is that, look, we have a lot of British staff. You know, sort of like 80% of our staff are kind of British trained. And so that does mean that, you know, if if the kind of society is the sum of its people, we do have a lot of staff there who have experience of working in the UK and bring that with them to the classes that they are teaching, and also to the pastoral care that they're giving. And I think we probably would all accept that pastoral care can be different depending on where you are in the world. But we do have local staff, and actually we have we're a training school. So we actually have a number of local staff who do PGC with us, and we will train them. And what I saw the other day was a perfect example probably of, a local member of staff and my deputy head who was kind of going through teaching and learning and how we can do things slightly differently. And it was just really powerful to see like this British kind of, approach to education sort of being administered by one of our members of staff to a local, young teacher who was like, oh, wow, it's really interesting. And that was quite powerful. So I think, look, there are differences inevitably. And we have, if I think about my time at CLC, we had, 45 nationalities represented, quite a heavy sort of Asian population there as well. But it's similar, I'd say. But I'd say, CLC is quite an international school, really, in the UK. And I think we're similar in that respect. We're an international school, culturally sensitive, of course, to our context. But, next week we've got a culture day where we will be celebrating everybody's kind of sort of culture.
Not allowed to do that in England anymore.
Of course. So, and that's a way that we can try and make sure that everybody is given the opportunity to, to kind of enjoy and share the things that they're proud of, and why not be proud of those things?
So we must talk about the curriculum, because I think one of the greatest of our exports in modern times is the education, which obviously schools such as yours are testimony to that. So you were telling me just earlier, so it's an A-level school currently.
Yes.
And you've taught, I think CLC is IB and A-levels,
correct,
isn't it?
As is Fettes. So my experience of the last 10 years has been doing A-level and IB side by side.
Wow.
Alongside actually GCSE before that. And the IB has its own equivalent NYP, but I think GCSE is the gold standard. And that's why we do that. So we are predominantly an A-level school.
Okay.
Look, obviously I've worked for the last 10 years doing A-level and IB side by side, and there are strengths to both of those programs. And I think they travel very well. I think they're understood well in Asia and in other parts of the world as well. But I think the thing about A-levels, and look, I did A-levels myself.
Which one will your daughters do as well?
Do you know what? It's really interesting. I took a school through IB accreditation recently, and I was having to explain to the students how IB was fantastic. They're like, Dad, you're always talking about IB. And I was like, well, you can do all of these subjects. They're like, yeah, but, maybe I don't want to do all 6 of those. I was like, you don't yet you don't want to do all of those, but you never know. But actually the beauty of doing A-levels is that you can really, individualize your program. Yeah. So, and one of the reasons why I think A-levels is fantastic is that, there are some things there that you can do, which you can't do in the IB system. So I'll give you an example. And actually, this is a very, I spoke to 20 students from Myanmar yesterday. And I just asked them what they wanted to do. 80% of them wanted to do STEM.
Yep.
Yeah. Which perhaps isn't unsurprising.
Yes.
But then you start saying, okay, well, what can if you've got someone who's not sure if they want to be a doctor or they want to be an engineer. And actually, if you're good at STEM, it's quite a common problem.
Right.
Maybe not a problem, maybe something to be kind of quite proud of. But, you're probably going to want to do biology, chemistry, physics, maths, right? Maybe even further maths, depending on, how kind of broadly you're going to apply. Ultimately, you can't do that in the IB. So, somebody who does want to do STEM and go down that route, A-levels is a perfect system for them because they can keep both of those doors open and still be competitive, which I think is the important factor. Look, the IB, for that person who is an all-rounder, great. You can do the IB. You can still do maths into the sixth form and maybe do it at standard level.
I'm trying to think if I know. I'm a big A-level fan.
Yes,
I'll put my cards on the table. If you ask any 16-year-old, do you really want to continue to go ahead and study English and maths and a foreign language and all these for another 2 years?
Yeah.
Which 16-year-olds say, yeah, I would do
this
that.
is the thing, but that's where I think the school can have a role to play as well, because, I would be contradicting myself if I didn't say this. sometimes students don't realize that actually that could be good for them in terms of what that might give them in terms of applying to university or something like that. So, however, sometimes students do want to take the kind of, if we can call it the easier route. I think as educators, what we have to do
controversial.
is to, and I say the easier route for them, whatever that might be. That's A-level or IB.
Easier to choose, at
Easier
least.
to choose. And we have to kind of say, well, you could do that, but it's not always about, what you might find easy. Some things are difficult actually in life. And you can learn a huge amount through the process of going through something. There's no doubt that IB students who I've taught who've then come back to school have said, I felt very prepared for university. Yeah. So, but look, I did A-levels myself. I was, very much on the humanities side, sort of history, politics, English, drama, that kind of stuff. So I wouldn't have been able to do that in the IB system. But, as a school, we are doing A-level in the sixth form. However, from August 2026, we are doing the IB career pathway. And that's because we want to have an alternative pathway for our students that we feel is going to be helpful to them and powerful when they go to apply to university, but which is going to enable them and facilitate them to kind of, do the best that they can in terms of university outcomes, which they might not have been competitive for if they had done A-levels. Now, and I can go into a bit more detail.
Yeah, let's just clarify, because I don't think that most people are not aware of where does the IBCP sit.
Yes. It's a really good point. So, for students who are looking to those kind of real top universities, A-levels could be a good thing for them. But we have a number of students at our school who, if they did A-levels, they might end up with, maybe C's, D's, maybe even an E. And, we probably both know that that isn't necessarily going to facilitate university entry. But, and some of that is because in the A-level system, the exams are terminal. And as we know, some students don't perform in exams, but they can be very good in coursework. So the beauty of the IB career pathway is that you choose a career-related study. We're going to do 3. So we're going to do engineering as the career-related study alongside IBDP courses in computer science and in
individual
maths.
courses.
Individual courses, which are IBDP courses, but you only have to do 2 alongside a career-related study. So that would be engineering in one case there, alongside maths and computer science. And then we have a sport one where we'll do sport as the career-related study and psychology, because that goes well together, and business. And then we have another one, which is business alongside maths, and something called digital society, which is a new IB course that they have on offer. Again, looking at how you can kind of harness things like social media and AI to sort of improve communication. So I don't think the majority of our students will do that, but it's something that we wanted to have to make sure that we were playing to the strengths of all of our students. And look, if that's right, you can imagine parents say, is this right for my child? Well, let's have a one-to-one discussion about how this could work for you. And what, the inevitable question is, does it facilitate university entry? The answer is yes.
Is it direct entry or foundational?
No, direct entry.
Okay.
Not to every university. Let's be really clear, Oxford and Cambridge are going to be off the table. But there are going to be some of those universities, even in the Russell Group and in places like the National University of Singapore, where students can enter university via the IB career program. So and we have, and actually Australia is another one. America are quite fond of that. Actually, American universities have their own engineering programs that they do as the career-related study at their university. And this can be a way to kind of put down a marker with that university. So we're trying to ensure that while we feel that traditional route A-levels has worked for us, it's worked for students. Look, we've got 2 offers this month from Oxford University for students who are doing A-levels. So it's working, and, we don't want to meddle too much if something's working well. But equally, we've got to be innovative and look at pathways which are going to accommodate all of our students. And there are some students who I think might struggle doing the traditional A-levels with us, but they've been with us, in year 9, year 10 through GCSE. We want to make sure that we've got something which is going to allow them to show the very best versions of themselves.
Yeah, I think it's common sense that, we want to see children doing well.
Yes.
Wherever they are, or whatever that means for them. But that leads me on to also thinking about alternative pathways.
Yes.
I mean, when your daughters are ready for uni in another 6, 7, 8 years, I mean, do you think, or let's say 10 years, Do you think it's going to be still the default option that graduates from secondary school do go to university?
I think I would probably say yes in Asia, in the UK. I think there are different appetites in other parts of the world. If you take the American system, for example, you know, the route into, right, if you took Silicon Valley, the people who are successful there, they are entrepreneurs, and maybe entrepreneurs from the outset. Whereas I think in the UK, it's a bit like, well, you get your degree first, you do this, maybe have a career, and then you're an entrepreneur. Whereas that kind of attitude about, well, actually, let's just try something, startup mentality. I do think the US is much better there
Mm-hmm.
at that than we are. And and Asia. But that might start to change gradually, but I think it will be a gradual change. There's no doubt that, I've just talked about a course called Digital Society that the IB runs. And that is something which is creeping towards thinking about students who are very good at the use of technology and AI, how actually the practical application of that in a business setting that they are doing themselves might be an education in itself. And although that might not be the education that we want for everybody as the default, I think we get left behind if we don't embrace the opportunities that come with that.
As a standalone course, I mean, shouldn't AI be taught in almost every one of our subjects? Shouldn't it be embedded and permeate through all of the disciplines?
Absolutely. I think it has a place as a kind of a tool for delivery of content research in every one of the subjects that we deliver, but the mechanics and infrastructure that's being used there and the opportunities that can come from AI as a standalone, I think is also very interesting. I mean, we do this, we were introducing design engineering as a department from August. Part of that will be thinking about machine learning, thinking about kind of robotics, thinking about sort of drones. If students get very kind of confident doing that, and, they can go into one of our partners like AirAsia and do that from 18, actually, that could be a really positive thing for them to be able to do.
Is that like a degree apprenticeship?
It could be, but it could just be entry into working at that firm where the possibilities for career development are pretty extensive. It does depend on the individual. We've said earlier on that not every child, shows their kind of best of themselves in terminal exams under time pressure after 2 years, whereas they might be prepared to put in a huge amount of time to make sure that they master a bit of kit so that you feel very safe when they're flying you somewhere, or that they are kind of really know their stuff because they're dedicated and they're going to put the time in to get real mastery. And there should be a place for that, I think, in the labour market.
One of my guests last week actually suggested that terminal exams, this is the second time I'm hearing this, first time I heard that expression, were the absolute fairest way to do assessments. So if something like the CP is much more sort of course work.
Absolutely. So, I mean, look, there's coursework in every one of the IB subjects. So there will be some exams, but coursework in that. But the career-related study is 100% coursework. So that is a real opportunity for, and also the other thing that comes with that, and this is where I think independent schools are at their best, is that if you're doing A-levels, right, you might have, something like 15 free periods. We obviously don't call them that, but the students
study period
in a week. And there is no doubt that the hardest thing to do as you transfer from GCSE to A-level is independence and knowing what to do with that time, setting your own, kind of subject parameters, what I'm going to research this in this hour that I've got, or what the kind of task that I'm going to do in the hour that I've got. If you do something like A-levels and you've got 15 of those hours to kind of manage yourself, it's tricky. But with something like the IB career pathway, you've only got 2 hours, which are study periods. So that means that there is a lot more scaffolding, a lot more support. So when you're doing that coursework, you've got a teacher there who can really direct you and make sure that you're staying on message and, using your time as productively as possible. There is no doubt, I think, that some of the students that I've taught over the last 20 years would have benefited from that level of support. Doesn't mean that they're not doing the work themselves. They're just doing it with a little bit more guidance.
Just what's right for each individual student.
Indeed.
Want to finish off with just a few, what do you see as other key issues in education? at the
Key
moment?
issues.
Yeah.
I mean,
Just let's limit it to 2 or 3.
Yeah, okay. I mean, key issues. I think there's no doubt AI is one of those in terms of, you know, plagiarism and how can we know that how can it be authenticated if we have AI? I think we need to get beyond just seeing AI as kind of like, right, okay, it's the evil kind of thing in our system. And look, yes, it does generate kind of work, but the quality is not great. So, and you can see it quite easily. But if we start getting students to use the AI to be asking really interesting questions and that prompt engineering and being able to say, well, actually, can you give me I've read this. Brilliant. You've just given me this chat GPT. Thank you for that. Give me other texts which are linked to that. What are those arguments? Oh, those arguments. Okay. Now I'm just going to start looking at those arguments myself and coming to a judgment about which I think is most interesting. That is the power of AI. And I think it would be foolish to ignore that power. We just need to educate the students on how to use it in a way which is going to enrich the way they study.
Just another type of guidance counsellor, really.
Exactly. That's one of them. I think mobile phones, devices.
So the news is that they're debating in the UK about banning social media until 16, as they've done in Australia.
Yeah. I mean, look, it's interesting. It's one of those things that I think retrospectively you come back and say, wow, did we really allow this thing to come into society without any regulation? The answer to that is yes.
Yes, we do.
And in 10 years' time, we'll look back on that and say that was flawed. So I can understand that putting regulations in place to guide people is a sensible option. I think in Australia, that's gone down very well.
But the guidance is already there for 13.
Yes.
Yet, what's the rules in school, particularly for the boarders?
Yeah. So you can imagine. We had I'm laughing because myself and the head of school, we meet with students to get student voice about their how much they can use their devices. So we've had this conversation quite recently. Look, it depends on the age of those students. Okay, so if they are GCSE students, they have their device and they have their device during prep time, and then it's taken away from them at night, so they can't use it. In terms of their phone, they can have their phone in the evening to kind of call home, do their messages and things like that, and then we take them away from them.
Yeah.
We also have at the weekends, as you would do, I think, in your own household, device free time where the house comes together and does something fun. Like we're going to have a quiz, or we're going to go to the park, or we're going to go and do whitewater rafting over here. Let's just not be using devices. So we try and control it in a way that you'd probably try and do in your own household. However, when we're talking about our year 13s, we have tried to trust them more with their devices, and they'll say, look, I've got to have my prep time, but there's other things I want to do and I need my device for that. And we do it on we do it if there's no issues with how that student is performing. We're not noticing that they are tired because they're kind of working on this all the time. We obviously have things in place to make sure that we can regulate what sites they're looking at as well. But we want to be able to trust the students. And obviously the house parent has the final say to say, look, no, I'm not sure this is good for you to be. But actually, if we've got a student who's saying, after prep finishes at sort of 9:00, I want to do a bit more research on my university, we don't want to turn down that opportunity, but we regulate it fairly and closely to make sure that it's not harming the students. But the younger students, when they don't have that maturity, the discipline, that's when we need to put in the controls ourselves.
Is 13 too young for them to access social media?
That would be my answer to that question, which is reflected in our system. I would not want my
daughter's turning 13 next year.
Exactly. I would not be comfortable with. She has a device for working on, but she doesn't use social media.
Too young, but when she turns 13,
we wouldn't want her to be using social media. I mean, that's how we feel about it, and we'd have a conversation about it and about why. And I think it's because if I can think of examples where a late email might have been sent to my daughter, quite innocent, but you receive it, you're quite tired. There's a kind of something's lost in translation, and that can knock that child. And suddenly a safe space that you think, I'm surrounded here by my family, I'm just going to go off to sleep. Suddenly you're thinking about something that's school related. And I think it takes you to be older, more mature to kind of deal with that and be able to compartmentalize and say, right, I'm going to park it for tomorrow. A 12 or 13-year-old can't do that. And
I haven't been able to do that.
No. And also, prefrontal cortex is still developing. That they scientifically don't necessarily have the ability to do that. Whereas when you're 16, the science would tell us that you are in a better position to be able to do that.
I don't know how it's gone down in Australia. I don't know how it's regulated, but kids are smart. They'll find a way around.
Maybe so. But you also communicate something in what you think about an issue by the default position you take.
Yes. Yeah.
And if you're not taking a default position,
agree.
Yeah, you may be open.
Because I do see, I saw among my children's friends that they were able to access social media before they were 13.
Yes.
Because there's lots of that happening as well. Yeah. One more issue. We like to have three.
So we've done AI, we've done
social
phones.
media.
That's interesting. So I think big issue in education, I think I'm going to go down this route. I think there has been a lack of project-based learning in the education system. And the drive has been to more and more exams. Some GCSE students are having 30 exams in the summer period. And, ultimately it's recall. And there isn't the opportunity for them to learn in a slightly different way, which is what project-based learning does for you. And, if we're talking about skills and developing those skills, having something which is not going to be assessed by an exam, but maybe the practical application and construction of something is something that I think old school D&T has had a bad reputation, and it's not really
D&T, design and
technology. And look, and I've noticed that as well, because it was a little bit forced. You'd have 20 students all making a monk tree. You're just like, who wants that? This is a bit ridiculous. But what I did at Fettes is I established a new qualification, engineering, enterprise and technology. And that was fusing sort of like, the theory of maths and physics they were learning in the classroom alongside the kind of, the digital kind of CAD that they were doing on their devices, and then sending that information to a laser cutter so that they're actually tangibly seeing what they've produced, then maybe making an automobile, seeing it work in the real world. And we decided to put in the higher project qualification as an alternative to one of the GCSEs. So this was the alarming bit for some of our parents, is that it was only half a GCSE. Why would you do that? It's not going to be as competitive. I disagreed with that because I felt the way of learning was more important than the outcome.
Number of GCSEs, people trying to do more and more GCSEs.
And we wrote to the universities to kind of reassure our parents, and they were like, this is great. To do something like this alongside the 8 or 9 GCSEs you're doing, no problem at all. And actually, when a student is in an interview at Imperial and they give you some physical things to kind of build, if you haven't had the opportunity to do that in a real world context, that's going to be more difficult for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Jonathan, it's been fascinating. Thank you very much for coming. And we should say that we're having this conversation before I get to visit the school, which I'm super excited about. Brilliant. And that's happening in a few weeks' time.
Well, I look forward to
So we'll probably hold it and air it afterwards, when everything that you've talked about Epsom Malaysia will make so much more sense. Because as we always say, to all of the parents, you absolutely have to see it for yourself.
Ruth, it's been a pleasure for me too. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for listening. If today's episode sparked questions, or if you're ready for support with UK boarding school admissions, we're here to help. Reach out to us at www.topschoolsadmissions.com or follow the link in the show notes. Your child's exceptional UK boarding school educational journey starts with a conversation, so let's have a chat.